This week we're covering Chapter 9, which talks about forms. We will talk about how forms work, the form element, text entry controls, buttons, menus, specialized inputs, form accessibility, and form design tips. Web forms have two components: the form on the page that collects input, and then an application on the server that processes the collected information. And this class doesn't focus on this application on the server. We'll take a look at an example here on the next slide, but I do teach a class, Web App Development, and it's CSCI 258. The prereq is CSCI 151. You need to know a little bit of Python. But that's what we'll do in that class. We'll be creating an application that processes the collected information from the forms. So let's take a quick look at what a web form transaction might look at. So here's your form in a web browser. The form is this part right here where it's asking for input. The user enters information in the form and then would hit submit. The browser encodes the information entered and sends it to the server. The application processes the information, and the application returns a response, for example, a thank you message or reloading the page. So some different things that the application, the web application might do are store information in a database, retrieve information from the database. Interacting with a database like this is called a dynamic website. So what we're doing in this class is just creating static websites. Pages are displayed. We create HTML pages, they're displayed. Dynamic websites, you might retrieve information from a database and populate a web page with that information and then send it back to be rendered in the browser. Web forms may be processed by any of the following technologies. Take a minute and just look through these. It's helpful because you will see them and you'll just have an idea that they're for something that we call back-end web development. It's on the server. The class that I teach, we use a back-end framework called Django, which uses the Python language. All right, let's look a little closer at the form element. The form element is a container for all the content in the form and its input controls. The action and method attributes are necessary for interacting with the processing program. So here we have action attribute and then the method attribute. The action attribute provides the location of the script or the application that will process the collected form data. The method attribute specifies how the encoded information should be sent to the server, and you can either have it equal to get or post. So get, the encoded data is tacked onto the URL sent to the server. So for instance, right here you can see where name equals Sally, and then the email equals, and it has it right here. That's actually added. That information is actually tacked on to the URL. Post, data is sent in a separate transaction and can be encrypted with HTTPS. Post is the most common method. Here's an example of some different form control elements you can use. They're also called widgets, and these are just different ways to collect data from the user. So you could have just a text box where they enter in information. You can have buttons that get pressed. You can have checkboxes that get selected. You can have radio buttons. Checkboxes, you can select multiple different checkboxes. Radio buttons, you can only select one of the group of radio buttons. And then it looks like we have a drop-down list over here. Form controls collect data in variable value pairs. So for example, you might have some variable that's equal to email. That's the name of the variable, and then the value is whatever the email address is, whatever was put in that input box. So you might have a variable called color, and then maybe there was a drop-down menu where you selected green. A variable is a bit of information collected by a form control. The reason we have variables is because we want to refer back to that information later on. The required name attribute in the control element provides the name of the variable for that control. So you can see that this is the name of the variable, last name, and then the person might enter in their last name in a text box, and that would be the value assigned to it. The variable name is also programmed into the web processing script or app, so the name in the markup must match the name in the processor. That's how the web application can refer to information that's collected in the form by using the variable names. The data entered or selected by the user in the form control is the value that gets sent to the server. It is paired with the variable for that control. You can provide a default value with the value attribute. So in this case, our variable name is last name, but they have a default value of unknown, and that would be sent to the server if they left the text input blank. Here's an example of a form control element, a text entry input. So we would specify input type equals text, and then in this example, name equals color, that's the variable name. Value equals red, that's the default value if the user does not supply anything. And max length, that sets a character limit for the field. Here's an example of another form control element, the password field. So we would specify type is equal to password. Here's our variable name. We have set the max length to 10. It's like the text entry field, except the characters are obscured from view, so we'll put in these dots instead of the actual characters that you're typing in. Here's an example of a multi-line text entry. So it's like a whole text area if you're going to have anticipate having a larger amount of text. You can see right here we have our variable name, but we're specifying the number of rows tall the field is, and then we're specifying the number of columns, so the height and width of this text area. You can specify a max length or a min length, and that would limit the number of characters that could be entered. A few more specialized text entry fields. You can have a search, email, telephone, URL. These input types are more semantically rich than a default text field. Browsers may provide keyboards tailored to the input type. Browsers may validate entries on the fly without using the server application. In this example, you can see where the input type is tel for telephone, and a numeric keyboard is provided. Over here we have an example where the type is email, and if the user didn't provide an @ sign, they would get some sort of message indicating that an @ sign is required for an email. Here's an example of submit and reset buttons. You just specify the type as submit or the type as reset. Submit will submit the collected data to the server. Does not require a variable name. Reset resets the form to its defaults. You can change the button text with the value attribute for each one of these. So reset, here you can see they have an attribute value, and then they have start over, and you can see start over is printed instead of reset. There are some ways to create custom buttons. We're not going to worry about it right now because they require you to know a little bit about JavaScript, and we haven't talked about JavaScript yet. Radio buttons are a common form control element. You can see what it looks like right here when it's rendered in a browser. You can only have one option selected. And then you can see the HTML code to specify a group of radio buttons. You have the type here, radio, the name of the variable, and then the value that variable is going to get set to if it was checked, if that option was checked. And you can see by default the first option is checked because we have checked written right here. Under 24, right here, this is the text that's rendered on your screen by the browser. Checkboxes are another common control element. They would be indicated by the type checkbox. Here's an example of what some checkboxes look like in a browser window. And then it's very similar to radio buttons. You've got a list. You have your name, which is the variable name. You've got a value that that variable gets assigned to. And in the case of checkboxes, you can have multiple things selected. So by default, they had a few items selected. That's why we have the word checked here on the first two options. And then you can see right here, this is the text that actually gets rendered on the screen. I'm just going to whip through some of these other things, and then you can come back and look at them closer, or the text does a good job of explaining these in a little bit more detail. But there's quite a few of them. You'll probably not use every single one of them in your project, so I want you to know they exist, and you'd be able to go back and look at them if you're interested in using them. So drop-down menus, that's another control element. Here would be an example of what one looks like in the browser, and then here's some HTML code that shows you how you would implement that. Scrolling menus, here's what a scrolling menu looks like in the web browser, and here's some details on how you could do that. Another form control element is the filed upload control. So if the user needs to upload some specific document like a resume or an image and so forth, you could use this control element. This is what it would look like in the browser, and I think we're all kind of familiar with this, where you'd select choose file, and then a user would have the option to go select whatever file it was they were wanting to upload. So you can read about that if you're interested in putting that in your website. Hidden controls, we won't need that for this class, but that is if you want to provide some information to the processing script. So right here we've specified a variable name, and then we specified a value, and that's a way for us to get information to the processing script. There are date and time controls. Here is what some of the date and time controls can look like. Some browsers may display date and time selection widgets. It's not universally supported. Another form control element are numeric controls. So you can see how you could select a range here. That little dot slides. You could select number of guests. The color selector is intended to provide a pop-up color picker for you to select a color. However, it's not well supported. Non-supporting browsers display a text entry field. Users may not be able to see the form. They may be listening to it with a screen reader. So you need to consider accessibility when you're creating your forms. Whereas a sighted user can see at a glance how elements are organized, form accessibility features create semantic connections between form components. So one of the things that you can do to make your forms more accessible is to associate a label, it's a descriptive label, with a form field. You can do this implicitly by surrounding the form control and the label with the label element. So they're both, the form control and the label are contained within the label element. Or if your form control has some sort of ID, you can create a label with the label element, and it just has the label in it, red, but it has an attribute for equals, and that's the ID of the control element. You can also have something called a field set or a legend. Field sets indicate a logical grouping of controls. So for example, a credit card name, number, date. By default, it's rendered with a box around the set of controls. And then a legend provides a caption for the enclosed fields. By default, it's displayed along the top edge of the field set. So here's an example of what a field set would look like with a legend. This is what it would look like in your browser. And then this is what it looks like in HTML. We have our controls surrounded are contained in a field set element. And then we've got the legend, which you can see up here, but then you can see how those controls are surrounded by this box. Form design tips. Avoid unnecessary questions. Consider the impact of label placement. Labels above fields tend to lead to faster completion. Choose input types carefully. Group related inputs. Primary actions should be visually dominant to secondary actions. And that's it.